Months after the wedding, Rosalind began noticing subtle yet unsettling changes in Julian's behavior. He often returned home late, offering vague explanations about extended prayer meetings or urgent church matters. While his excuses sounded plausible at first, they began to wear thin as the frequency of these late nights increased. Rosalind's trust, once unwavering, started to falter as inconsistencies piled up. Receipts for expensive restaurants she had never visited, unfamiliar perfume lingering on his suits, and hushed phone calls made her question the man she thought she knew. Julian, confident in his ability to manipulate those around him, continued his double life without much concern. To the congregation, he was still the charismatic pastor, preaching messages of faith and sacrifice. Behind the scenes, however, he grew increasingly reckless, emboldened by Rosalind's initial willingness to ignore the red flags. He underestimated her resolve, failing to realize that her silence was not born out of naivety but out of careful observation and growing suspicion. Rosalind, while deeply hurt by the signs of deceit, decided to approach the situation with patience and caution. She confided in James Miller, her longtime friend, and together they began to piece together the extent of Julian's deceptions. James shared his findings with Rosalind: financial discrepancies in church funds, testimonies from past acquaintances of Julian, and rumors circulating within the congregation about his indiscretions. Each revelation chipped away at the image of the man Rosalind had married. As Rosalind and James quietly gathered evidence, Julian's behavior became more erratic. His sermons grew increasingly disjointed, and his once flawless charisma began to show cracks. Members of the congregation started to notice his lack of focus and his uncharacteristic bursts of anger when questioned about his leadership. The whispers among parishioners became louder, and Rosalind realized she was no longer alone in her doubts. Determined to uncover the full truth, Rosalind confronted Julian one evening after he returned home late. She held up a receipt for a luxury hotel stay she hadn't known about. "Julian," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I need to know what's going on. Where have you been, and what have you been doing with the money meant for the church?" Julian hesitated for only a moment before slipping into his usual charm. "Rosalind, my love, you don't need to worry about these things. The church requires sacrifices, sometimes personal ones. You have to trust me." But Rosalind was no longer the woman who blindly accepted his words. "Trust? How can I trust you when you've been lying to me? I've seen the receipts, Julian. I've heard the whispers. I deserve the truth." Backed into a corner, Julian's demeanor shifted. He became defensive, deflecting her accusations and trying to turn the blame onto her. "You're listening to gossip," he said angrily. "You're letting people poison your mind against me? I've done nothing but dedicate myself to this ministry, and to you." Rosalind refused to back down. "If that's true, then why are there funds missing? Why are there so many unanswered questions? Julian, I gave up so much to support you in this church, but I won't be made a fool of." Her unwavering resolve shook Julian, but instead of coming clean, he lashed out, accusing Rosalind of undermining his work and questioning her faith. The argument ended with Julian storming out of the house, leaving Rosalind more certain than ever that she needed to take action. The following Sunday, Rosalind attended church with a quiet determination. She sat through Julian's sermon, which was filled with empty platitudes and forced conviction, and afterward, she addressed the congregation herself. With James by her side, she presented the evidence they had gathered: financial records, testimonies, and undeniable proof of Julian's misdeeds. The church, once enraptured by Julian's charisma, erupted in shock and outrage. Julian, caught off guard, tried to regain control, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. His attempts to justify his actions fell flat, and the congregation quickly turned against him. In the days that followed, Julian was removed from his position as pastor, and an internal investigation revealed the full extent of his embezzlement and infidelity. For Rosalind, the revelation was painful but necessary. She had loved Julian deeply and believed in his vision, but she couldn't ignore the harm he had caused, not only to her but to the entire community. With the support of James and other members of the congregation, she began the difficult process of rebuilding her life and restoring the church's reputation. Julian's downfall was swift and public. Stripped of his authority and exposed for his lies, he left New Orleans in disgrace. His once bright future was now overshadowed by scandal, leaving a legacy of betrayal and deception. For Rosalind, the experience was both heartbreaking and liberating. She emerged from the ordeal stronger, her faith in herself renewed. No longer blinded by love or manipulated by charm, she used her resources and influence to rebuild the church and focus on the philanthropic work she had always been passionate about. Her resilience and determination became an inspiration to others, a testament to the strength that comes from facing the truth and refusing to be defined by someone else's mistakes. Rosalind's hands shook as she scrolled through Julian's phone, each message a dagger to her heart. The screen was flooded with evidence of his betrayals, explicit photos, suggestive messages, and plans for secret meetings. Some texts promised lavish gifts, others trips to destinations Rosalind had never even heard Julian mention. It was more than she could bear. Her breath hitched, and her chest tightened as the full scope of his deception became clear. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had stood at the altar and promised her a lifetime of devotion, with the man whose phone was now an open book of infidelity and lies. This wasn't a lapse in judgment or a single mistake. It was a pattern, deliberate and premeditated, stretching back months, if not years.
Still, Rosalind knew that confronting Julian without a plan would only backfire. He was a master manipulator, skilled at spinning words to suit his narrative. She needed undeniable, irrefutable proof, not just for herself, but for the congregation that had placed their trust in him. She carefully took screenshots of the most damning messages and forwarded them to her own email before placing the phone back on the nightstand, exactly where she had found it. The next morning, Rosalind confided in James Miller, her longtime friend and trusted confidant. Together, they devised a plan to gather more evidence and ensure that Julian couldn't talk his way out of the accusations. James, who had already been suspicious of Julian for some time, helped Rosalind track his movements and discreetly interview members of the congregation. Several women came forward with their own stories, tearful confessions of how Julian had used his position of power to manipulate and seduce them, promising spiritual guidance while exploiting their vulnerabilities. One of the women, Melissa Hill, was particularly distraught. She admitted to Rosalind and James that her relationship with Julian had started innocently, but over time had spiraled into something she deeply regretted. Melissa provided detailed accounts of their encounters, messages, and even receipts for gifts Julian had given her, including jewelry and stays at luxury hotels. Her testimony became a cornerstone of Rosalind's growing case against him. Meanwhile, Julian remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Confident in his ability to maintain control, he continued his double life, unaware that Rosalind and James were meticulously unraveling the threads of his deception. Rosalind played her part perfectly, maintaining the facade of a supportive wife while quietly documenting every piece of evidence she could find. Her nights were sleepless, her days filled with an icy determination to expose the truth. The breaking point came one Sunday morning during a service. Julian stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon about integrity and faith, his voice resonating with the passion and charisma that had captivated the congregation for years. But this time, Rosalind wasn't sitting passively in the pews. She was ready. When Julian finished his sermon and the congregation applauded, Rosalind rose from her seat and walked to the front of the church. The room fell silent as she took the microphone, her usually calm and reserved demeanor replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her, "I have something important to share, something that will affect us all. I've stood by Pastor Julian's side as his wife, believing in his words and his leadership. But today, I must speak the truth." Julian's face froze, his smile faltering as he realized something was wrong. Rosalind continued, pulling out printed copies of the messages, receipts, and testimonies she had collected. "This man, who we have trusted to guide us spiritually, has betrayed not only me but all of us. He has used this church as a platform for his lies, his infidelity, and his greed. Gasps echoed through the congregation as Rosalind handed the evidence to James, who began distributing copies to the stunned parishioners. The room erupted into murmurs of shock, disbelief, and outrage as they read the damning details. Julian attempted to speak, his voice rising above the commotion. "This is absurd. These are lies meant to discredit me." But Rosalind was prepared. "These are not lies," she said firmly, holding up her phone to project a slideshow of the evidence onto the church's projector. The explicit messages, photos, and financial records left no room for doubt. Julian's protests grew weaker as the weight of the evidence bore down on him. Members of the congregation who had once admired him now stared at him with anger and betrayal in their eyes. Some rose from their seats and left the church in disgust, while others demanded answers. That afternoon, the church board convened an emergency meeting. Julian was immediately removed from his position as pastor, and an investigation into the misuse of church funds was launched. The once revered leader of New Life Church left the building in disgrace, his reputation shattered. For Rosalind, the moment was bittersweet. Exposing Julian had come at a great personal cost, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter. With the support of James and the congregation, she worked to rebuild the church's reputation and restore trust among its members. Her resilience and courage became a source of inspiration, a testament to the strength of a woman who refused to be defined by betrayal. Julian, now stripped of his power and influence, disappeared from public life. His actions left a lasting scar on the community. But Rosalind's determination to uncover the truth ensured that his lies would no longer harm others. In the end, it was Rosalind's unwavering resolve and faith in justice that brought light to the darkness that had overshadowed their church. Julian knelt beside Rosalind's lifeless body, his hands slick with blood as he desperately tried to stop the inevitable. The room, once filled with Rosalind's accusations and his frantic denials, was now silent except for his shallow, ragged breaths. The realization of what he had done hit him like a freight train. Rosalind, the woman who had trusted and loved him despite everything, was gone. His mind raced with thoughts of guilt, fear, and self-preservation. It was an accident, he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He repeated the words over and over, as if saying them aloud might somehow make them true, might somehow absolve him of the blame. But no matter how many times he said it, the reality stared back at him, crimson and cold. Julian staggered to his feet, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He paced the room, his mind spiraling as he considered his next move. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let anyone find out. He had worked too hard to build his life, to construct the perfect image of himself as a man of God, a leader, a devoted husband. That image couldn't survive this. He glanced back at Rosalind's body, his heart sinking as the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. Her blood had soaked into the pristine white tiles, a stark contrast that made it impossible to look away. For a moment, he thought of calling for help, of confessing everything and accepting the consequences of his actions. But the thought was fleeting. Julian was a man who had built his life on manipulation and control, and he couldn't let go of that now, not even in the face of his own guilt. Instead, he moved quickly, his mind switching to damage control. He grabbed a towel from the kitchen, wiping his hands and trying to clean up the blood as best he could. His movements were frantic, disorganized, The crimson stains smeared instead of disappearing. A grim reminder of the life he had just extinguished. He needed to get rid of the evidence. He needed to make this go away. But as he worked, a knock at the door shattered the silence. Julian froze. His blood running cold. Another knock. Louder this time. "Pastor Brooks," a voice called from the other side. It was James Miller. Julian's breath hitched. He had forgotten about James. He hadn't considered that Rosalind, in her resolve to expose him, might have confided in her closest friend. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out. He couldn't let James see this. He couldn't let anyone know what had happened. "Pastor?" James's voice came again. More urgent now. "Is everything all right? Rosalind said she needed to talk to you. I haven't heard from her." Julian took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had always been good at improvising, at weaving lies to suit his needs. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. He stepped toward the door, wiping his face with the towel in a feeble attempt to hide his panic. Before opening it, he glanced back at Rosalind's body, now partially obscured by the couch. When he finally opened the door, his face was pale, his eyes wide with feigned surprise. "James," he said, his voice shaky but composed enough to sound believable. I wasn't expecting you." James frowned, his eyes narrowing as he studied Julian's face. "Where's Rosalind? She was supposed to meet me earlier, but she never showed up. I've been calling her, but she's not answering." Julian hesitated, his mind scrambling for an explanation. She's not feeling well," he said, forcing a weak smile. "She went to bed early. I think all of this has been a bit much for her." James didn't look convinced. He glanced past Julian into the house, his eyes scanning the living room. "Mind if I come in? I'd like to check on her." Julian's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he couldn't let James inside. "Now's not a good time," he said quickly, stepping forward to block the doorway. "She needs rest, and I don't want to disturb her." James's eyes narrowed further, suspicion clear on his face. "Julian," he said slowly, his voice firm. "What's going on?" "Rosalind was upset when I spoke to her earlier. She said she had something important to tell me." "If something's happened." "Nothing's happened," Julian snapped, his voice louder than he intended. The outburst startled both men, and Julian quickly tried to recover, lowering his voice. "I mean, everything's fine. James." "Really?" But James wasn't buying it. He stepped back, pulling out his phone. "If you won't let me see her, I'll call the police. Let them sort this out." Panic surged through Julian. He couldn't let it come to that. "Wait," he said, holding up his hands. "There's no need for that. Just give me a moment. I'll go get her." James crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "I'm waiting." Julian nodded, retreating back into the house and closing the door behind him. He leaned against it, his mind racing. He knew his time was running out. There was no way to explain this away. No way to undo what had already been done. As he stood there, staring at Rosalind's lifeless body, he realized that the life he had so carefully constructed was over. When the police arrived minutes later, called by James, they found Julian sitting on the floor of the living room, his head in his hands. Rosalind's body lay behind him, A grim testament to the confrontation that had spiraled out of control. He didn't resist as they cuffed him and led him away. His once confident demeanor replaced by hollow resignation. In the days that followed, the story of Julian Brooks and Rosalind's tragic death dominated headlines. A shocking tale of betrayal, greed, and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. For the congregation of New Life Church, it was a reckoning, a reminder that even those who preach faith and integrity are not immune to the darkest corners of human nature. And for James, it was a painful loss. The memory of his dear friend Rosalind forever shadowed by the man who had deceived and destroyed her. Melissa Hill's testimony was the final nail in Julian Brooks' coffin. Standing in front of the packed courtroom, her voice trembled at first but grew steadier as she recounted her experiences. She described how Julian had seduced her under the guise of offering spiritual guidance, weaving scripture into his manipulation to make her feel special, chosen, and above all, loyal to him. She detailed the extravagant gifts, the secret meetings, and, most damningly, his whispered plans to free himself from his marriage to Rosalind. He told me he was trapped, Melissa said, her voice breaking. That she didn't understand him. That their marriage wasn't real. He promised me things, love, a future, but only if I kept our relationship a secret. I believed him, until I couldn't anymore. Her testimony was devastating. Not just for its content but for the clarity with which it painted Julian as a man driven by greed, lust, and ambition. It shattered any lingering illusions about the man who had once been a beloved pastor. The prosecution continued to build their case methodically, leaving no room for doubt. Detectives presented forensic evidence, including traces of Rosalind's blood found in Julian's car and on the marble table. The smear of blood he had hastily attempted to clean up was shown under UV light, making his feeble attempts at covering his tracks even more incriminating. The surveillance footage of Julian driving late at night, combined with witness accounts of loud arguments and crashing sounds from neighbors, further strengthened the case. Financial records revealed years of embezzlement, with church funds funneled into luxury hotel stays, expensive jewelry, and gifts for his many lovers. Emails and text messages recovered from Julian's devices exposed the depth of his deceit, each one a damning piece of evidence that painted him as a man who had lived a double life for years. Detective Camila Wright's testimony highlighted the timeline of Rosalind's disappearance and the inconsistencies in Julian's story. She methodically dismantled his alibi, presenting evidence that placed Rosalind in the house on the night of her death and proving that Julian's claim of her leaving town was a lie. This was not a crime of passion, Wright concluded. This was a calculated act by a man desperate to protect his lies and maintain his lifestyle. In his defense, Julian's legal team argued that Rosalind's death was an accident, the result of a heated argument that had spiraled out of control. They attempted to portray him as a flawed but deeply religious man who had succumbed to pressure and made poor decisions. But their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The trial dragged on for weeks, with every new revelation further tarnishing Julian's reputation. Parishioners who had once adored him now watched with a mix of anger and disbelief, their faith in him shattered. The courtroom was often packed with members of the community, media, and curious onlookers eager to witness the downfall of the man who had once stood as a pillar of their church. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Julian Brooks was found guilty on all charges, including second-degree murder, embezzlement, and fraud. The judge, citing the severity of his crimes and the breach of trust he had committed as a spiritual leader, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Julian's stoic mask finally cracked. He slumped in his seat, his head bowing as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. The once charismatic pastor who had commanded the love and loyalty of his congregation now sat as a broken man, stripped of his power, his reputation, and his freedom. For Rosalind's friends and loved ones, the verdict was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but it could not undo the loss of a woman who had been a beacon of grace, generosity, and kindness. James Miller, who had fought tirelessly to expose Julian's lies, wept quietly in the courtroom, mourning the friend he had admired and loved. The community, too, was left to pick up the pieces. The church, once thriving under Julian's leadership, struggled to rebuild in the wake of the scandal. Parishioners who had been deceived by Julian wrestled with feelings of betrayal and guilt for not seeing the truth sooner. Yet, amidst the grief and anger, there was also a sense of resolve, a determination to move forward and ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. In the end, the story of Julian Brooks and Rosalind's tragic death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition, deception, and betrayal. It was a story that left scars on everyone involved. But it also served as a testament to the strength of those who refused to let the truth be buried. Rosalind's memory lived on, not just as a victim but as a woman who, in her final moments, had fought courageously to expose the darkness hidden behind a veil of piety. As Julian Brooks was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the gravity of the moment hung heavy in the air. The once revered pastor, who had inspired countless sermons on faith and morality, now faced a future behind bars. The 20-year sentence handed down for involuntary manslaughter and multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement was a damning end to the life he had so carefully crafted. The judge's final words during sentencing echoed in the minds of all who had gathered. "You were entrusted with the spiritual well-being of your community," she said. "Instead of honoring that trust, you used it for personal gain, exploiting those who believed in you. Your actions have caused irreparable harm, not only to those closest to you but to an entire congregation. This court hopes that this sentence serves as a reminder of the responsibility that comes with leadership." The congregation of New Life Church, once united by faith and community, found itself fractured in the aftermath. Some clung to the belief that Julian was a man who had simply fallen under immense pressure, unwilling to completely abandon the man they had once idolized. Others felt deeply betrayed, their trust shattered by his greed and deception. The church building, once filled with song and prayer, stood empty as the congregation dissolved. In the weeks following the trial, it was officially closed, its doors locked and its future uncertain. For Rosalind's friends and loved ones, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of justice. James Miller, who had tirelessly worked to expose Julian's lies, attended the sentencing with tears in his eyes. "She didn't deserve this," he told reporters after the trial. "Rosalind was a kind, generous soul who gave everything to her community. Her memory will live on. But the loss of her light is something we'll never fully recover from." Rosalind's estate, once a substantial source of funding for the church's charitable programs, was redirected by her will to independent organizations that supported causes she had championed in life, education, housing for the underprivileged, and women's empowerment. Her legacy, though marred by tragedy, became a beacon for those who sought to honor her life by continuing her work. Meanwhile, Julian's incarceration was marked by solitude and introspection. Stripped of his power and influence, he became just another inmate, left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. Letters from his former congregation dwindled over time, replaced by silence and fading memories of his once lofty position. For a man who had thrived on admiration and control, the isolation was a punishment in itself. The media frenzy surrounding the case eventually faded, but the cautionary tale of Julian Brooks and Rosalind remained a lasting reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and betrayal. Schools of theology and leadership used the case as an example of the importance of integrity and accountability, while communities reflected on the responsibilities that come with trust and power. For many, the story of Julian and Rosalind was a tragedy with no winners. Only lessons learned too late. It stood as a testament to the consequences of deception, greed, and betrayal, as well as a reminder of the resilience of those who choose to seek justice, even in the face of unimaginable loss. James Miller, though deeply affected by the loss of his dear friend Rosalind, found solace in the closure brought by the verdict. He had fought tirelessly to ensure her truth was revealed and justice served, and that fight became a source of purpose for him. James redirected his energy toward rebuilding trust within the fractured community, organizing support groups for those who had been disillusioned by Julian's betrayal. He sought to repair the damage left in the wake of the scandal, reminding others that faith, when grounded in accountability and truth, could still be a force for good. Rosalind's charitable organizations, the hallmark of her generosity and compassion, were placed under the stewardship of new management. The initiatives she had championed, supporting education, providing shelter for the underprivileged, and empowering women, continued to thrive. A testament to her enduring legacy. Her name became synonymous with kindness and resilience, a bright light that continued to inspire even after her tragic death. For Jocelyn, Rosalind's longtime confidant, the ordeal was transformative. She had once viewed Julian as a symbol of hope, a man whose charisma and faith seemed unshakable. But the revelations of his deceit forced her to confront the painful truth about appearances and the ease with which trust can be manipulated. Determined to rebuild her life and regain her faith in humanity, Jocelyn moved to a new city, where she focused on her personal growth and spiritual healing. Her journey became one of renewal, a commitment to rediscovering faith rooted in honesty and integrity. Julian's name, once spoken with reverence, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how corruption can hide behind even the most righteous facades. His story served as a stark warning about the dangers of blind faith and the importance of holding leaders accountable for their actions. The scars left by his betrayal ran deep, but they also fueled important conversations about trust, power, and the necessity of transparency within both religious and secular communities. Though the echoes of Julian's deceit lingered, the resilience of those who had suffered because of him prevailed. The community, forever changed by the events, found strength in its pursuit of truth and justice. Rosalind's legacy, James's unwavering commitment to rebuilding trust, and Jocelyn's determination to heal all stood as reminders that even in the face of profound loss, there is the potential for growth, renewal, and a brighter future.